Hi, we reached the final chapter of 1 Samuel today with the death of Saul and Jonathan. As you can see on the right side of the screen, we're completing this chiasm that covers the second half of 1 Samuel, beginning with the metaphorical death of Saul as king, when Samuel cut him off after Saul cut off Samuel's royal robe, and now the physical death of Saul and Jonathan. As we'll see, there are some controversial elements about the death of Saul's sons. We'll hear that his sons all died, and yet the list of sons here, as you can see on the left side of the screen, is not the same as what we heard earlier. And not only that, in 2 Saul, he has more sons. So we'll have to explore some elements of that. Scholars tend to treat that as a matter of sources, and recognizing that not all of 1 and 2 Samuel was written at the same time, which is certainly easy to agree with. But as I've been showing in the last few chapters, it certainly seems that at least 1 Samuel 27 to 31, if not all of 1 Samuel, is a reflection from after exile in the time of Persian control of the rebuilt Jerusalem in the 5th century BCE. And I've shown in the last videos, including in the introduction of this section, the evidence for some of that. So it might well be that what we're seeing here is a reflection from the end of monarchy, not just about the death of Saul, but the issue of what to do after exile and whether monarchy was a good or bad idea or not. Whereas what we'll see in 2 Samuel is the story of David's reign, and we'll also see how that leads to the question of the succession. Because what was established in 1 Samuel 8 was not a dynasty, but simply a monarchy, on the principle that Yahweh would choose the person that would be king, and the people would affirm that. So there was no promise or even expectation that the current king's sons would take over. So the fact that Saul's sons are dead within the covenant element of Yahweh's relationship with Israel and having Saul as king, the sons would have no particular priority. And we saw that at the very beginning of 1 Samuel with the corruption of the priest Eli's sons and that of Samuel's sons, who were never really in the role. So whether it was priest or as prophet, there was not a sense that there was a dynasty, especially if the sons were not up for it. So we'll have to see in 2 Samuel what that has to do with Saul's sons, but we'll see that the narrator is reporting that some of them are dead here. We're also going to see that this is one of two versions of the death of Saul. We'll see the second one in 2 Samuel 1, and again scholars want to attribute that to sources, but it may be just a matter of the politics and propaganda of presenting the story of David's reign, accession of the throne in the first few chapters of 2 Samuel, and the death of Saul here. So just like then and now, the fog of war or the propaganda of politics can make texts inconsistent, unclear, as well as the historical nature of different writers writing over different times, as scholars tend to see it. So we've completed the sandwich elements here that led us to see the story in 27 and 29 as simultaneous to the story in 30, as we see here. So as we get to chapter 31, we're following from chapter 28. If you haven't watched the last videos, you may note that chapters 27, 29, and 30 were all a David sequence. David with the Philistines, and then David rescuing his wives and the people of Ziklag, while Saul was desperately consulting the woman of Endor and having the dead Samuel come up simply to tell him that tomorrow, which is today in the story, that Saul and his sons would join Samuel on the other side. So that's the beginning of the scene here. I have no key words up, because really in the short chapter of only 13 verses, there aren't really key words. In the first scene we'll look at today, plainly the conversation is between Saul and his armor bearer, so that's repeated several times. And in the second scene, the question of the people of Jabesh Gilead, who take the bones of Saul and Jonathan and take them away from where the Philistines had put them, and then they'll be recovered way late in 2 Samuel. But other than that, there aren't really key words. What we have in 1 Samuel 31, 1 to 8, though, is this chiasm, and we're only going to look at 1 Samuel 1 to 7 because really the scene is there, but the chiasm frames the death of Saul. So let's jump right into our scene, and I'll just leave this up here, and we'll look at it. In fact, I'll leave the atlas up so we can see what we're doing. Maybe I'll highlight something about that here, because although Mount Gilboa is not on this map here, here's where you can see where it is, and then you can see from here where they're going to, the Philistines are going to take the bodies of Saul and Jonathan to Beth Shan, and then where the people of Jabesh Gilead will rescue them. So that's the locations we're going to see, and we can see them on the bigger atlas here up in the north where this battle's taking place. And we'll note that it's close to the River Jordan, as the narrator tells us. So Mount Gilboa, not on this map, has to be close enough that these people can be aware of what's happening as we go. So the Philistines fought against Israel. A generic start here that shifts the story. As Bodner notes below, a participle that gives a sense of non-linear time sequence, and that's the point that I was just making. So the Philistines were fighting against Israel while David is rescuing Ziklag, and the men of Israel fled before the Philistines, and many fell on Mount Gilboa. Notice the stylized summary of that as the narrator. There's no actual description of battle, and Saul's not there. And you know who else isn't there anywhere in this chapter is Yahweh. We would hardly know this is a biblical story. It just seems like a war story. But we'll see why that is next chapter. So fell on Mount Sinai. Literally many fell slain, framing our chiasm here. And notice we'll see in 2 Samuel a number of elements where it clusters, the same term clusters around the death of Saul and his sons. So a fell on Mount Gilboa, we noticed that was mentioned earlier in 28:4. It's also part of the refrain of Saul's death we'll see in the next chapter. So story continues, and as Joel Baden notes, what are the chances that the only time Saul was wounded, the time when he died, was also the only battle that took place while David was allied with the Philistines? If that's the case, if he's still allied with the Philistines in chapter 30, or if he's left them by that, certainly by chapter 30 he's left them. So Bodner's suggesting this is taking place simultaneously with what we saw in chapter 29, but I was suggesting it was more likely to be simultaneous with chapter 30 when David is way down here. The Philistines overtook Saul and his sons. It's an interesting statement given that it already said that the men of Israel fled before the Philistines. So in this retreat, apparently the Philistines find them in particular. The word for overtook is literally cling, cleave, or follow closely. And we can go back to 14:22 and see its opposite here. When the Israelites had gone into hiding in the hill country, heard that the Philistines were fleeing, and they too followed closely after them in the battle, and Yahweh gave Israel the victory that day. But now it's the opposite. So as the Philistines chased down from them with no ceremony at all, we heard the Philistines killed Jonathan and Abinadab and Malchishua. Now Jonathan we certainly know, and as my note below notes, how unceremoniously the narrator dispatches with David's bosom buddy that we saw so much earlier. But Abinadab was named earlier as a son of Jesse, which is, say, one of David's brothers, as we can see back here in 16:8. Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel, but he wasn't the one, and then eventually David was. Malchishua, though, was mentioned, and let's go back to 14:49, because that's an interesting contrast. Here we heard about Ishvi. But there's no Ishvi mentioned here, and is never mentioned again. So why the substitution of Abinadab for Ishvi, I don't know, and no scholar that I found can know. Nor is there a mention of Ishbaal, you can see down here, who will be important in 2 Samuel. So those are the elements I was suggesting are confused, and I don't have a specific answer. Later in 2 Samuel, we could see that perhaps it's a matter of sources, but we don't have to look at that now. So the sons of Saul here summarized are describing as dying on the same day, just as Eli's sons did back in the very beginning. So again, these last chapters summarizing and recalling the entire book, which is part of the reason why I'm suggesting that the whole book might well be a reflection from the time of exile on the failure of monarchy. So the narrator continues, the battle pressed hard upon Saul. And notice how the narrator, without describing a lot of details, is building the tension. So first the Israelites flee from the Philistines, now the Philistines overtook Saul and his sons, and now the battle pressed hard on. As Bodner notes below, the reader could well wonder, where is Abner? And isn't that a good question? Let's read the verse, then we'll go back to my note below, which raises a very interesting issue. The battle pressed hard upon Saul, literally was heavy upon him. The archers found him, and he was badly wounded by him. But the archers found him is very suspicious, because nowhere are the Philistines described as archers. So we have to look at two elements of this. The scholar Malul has done the most on this, and he notes below, he asks, how the sons could be killed by Philistines while the king is slayed by the archers? Wouldn't they be near each other? Which would say archers shoot from relatively up close. So if the sons were already dead, then wouldn't Saul have been with him? And how could the archers have gotten that close? And he suggests that the archers are a fifth column among Saul's closest men who are secretly working for David. And we're going to look at the evidence for that around the term archers, which we hear right here. So literally the term for archers is men of the bow, Anashim Bakasheth here, and he notes that no other place in the Old Testament are archers mentioned as ever forming part of the Philistine army, and that Anashim, for men, usually refers to David's people, not the Philistines, as we've seen before. So what he's suggesting, relying on 1 Chronicles, which admittedly, although he doesn't raise the issue, is a doubtful historical source, since Chronicles is certainly written later and for very different purposes. So using it as factual basis is questionable, but let's look at that verse just to see why Malul's using it, because we see here in 1 Chronicles 12:2, the Benjaminites were archers and could shoot arrows and sling stones with either the right hand or the left. You heard they were Benjaminites, Saul's kindred. And that leads us back to the challenge of what David said, or what Saul said to the Benjaminites back here. So Saul heard that David and those who were with him had been located. Saul was sitting at Gibeah under the tamarisk tree with a spear in his hand, and all his servants were standing around him. And Saul said to his servants who stood around him, "Hear now, you Benjaminites, will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards? Will he make you commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds? Is that why you are all conspired against me? No one discloses to me why my son makes a league with the son of Jesse. None of you is sorry for me or discloses to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait as he is doing today," much like Captain Queeg in the Cain Mutiny. But we don't hear a response from the Benjaminites, and the narrator doesn't argue either. So left pregnantly back there in chapter 22 was the idea that Saul was right. He wasn't, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not following you. And what the case here is that Saul was paranoid about the Benjaminites, but perhaps he was exactly right, that they recognized that Saul was no longer Yahweh's anointed, or at least that he wasn't the king they wanted, given the situation with the oath to kill anyone who dared to eat, including his son Jonathan when he dared to eat the honey and his eyes were brightened. They may well have decided, either for theological or practical reasons, that their future was with David. David found himself a safe place to be down in Ziklag and dispatched these Benjaminites to take care of Saul, while David was providing the spoil for the elders of Judah. We can't prove that, and certainly the text is written so that we can't prove that, but it's certainly also written so we may suspect it, because certainly the original audience, whether that was in the contemporaneous time in the 9th century BCE or 10th century BCE even, or in the 6th or 5th century of exile or post-exile, would have known more about this situation than we do, although they might not have quote-unquote remembered the Philistines. But the archers certainly make that suspicious there. So regardless of whether these are Philistine archers or his own compatriots who turn on him, we're told he was badly wounded, or literally he writhed greatly. And it's really not a matter of his wounding, it's a matter of being on the ground writhing around. So in this scene here, which we will look at next when we get to the next chapter to compare the second scene of the death reported by an Amalekite. Notice that this scene is not witnessed to by anybody, and since Saul and the armor bearer are both going to be dead, this is coming directly from the narrator with no apparent evidence from witnesses within the text. So Saul said to his armor bearer, using this phrase, "nose kalev," 4 times in this phrase, and it recalls 2 other times. 14:1-17, when Jonathan was his armor bearer, but very interestingly 16:21, and let's go back to see that, where David came to Saul and entered his service, and Saul loved him greatly, and he became his armor bearer. So in that sense, David was his armor bearer, and we've never heard that that was taken away. And so in that sense, even though we know that literally David is not here, the armor bearer, symbolically David, is told to draw your sword and thrust me through with it. And when he refuses, we can recognize that we saw in chapter 24 and in chapter 26 how insistently David said, "I will not harm the Lord's anointed." So in that sense, at least, the armor bearer is symbolically David, if not, certainly not literally David. So we see there's a little chiasm in the phrase. We've noticed a number of those in this section, individual verse, ABA chiasms, around the repetition of thrust me through. So thrust me through so the uncircumcised may not come in the middle. So draw your sword, and as Bodner notes, the only words of direct speech in the chapter. The narrator isolates Saul's words in order to emphasize their significance. And as we look at this verse, it's really important that we all put it alongside Judges 9:54. Let's look at that here and we can see. So immediately he called his young man who carried his armor and said, "Draw your sword and kill me, people will not say to me, a woman killed him." So the young man thrust him through and he died. When the Israelites saw that Abimelech was dead, they all went home. Notice it's almost exactly the same, although Abimelech is dead there as a judge that the narrator disapproves of, and perhaps that's the parallel here. So my note below from that verse notes it where the servant obeys the order to kill his master Abimelech. And the quote here from Bodner Let me get back to the beginning of the quote. On the one hand, the invocation of Abimelech in 1 Samuel 31 implies a judgment, not so much on Saul himself, but rather on the political decision to opt for a monarchy. On the other hand, in 2 Samuel 11:21, Joab refers to the death of Abimelech. The reader can appreciate the allegorical point. David, with a recklessness that rivals Abimelech, got too close to the wall, as it were, and was dealt a serious blow by a woman. And we can just see what he's referring to in 2 Samuel 11:21 here. Joab recalling this, who killed Abimelech, son of Jerubbaal, did not a woman throw an upper millstone on him from the wall? And that's around the issue of Uriah. So this little story from Judges will play a role all the way through into 2 Samuel 11 and 12. So Saul said to his armor bearer, "Draw your sword and thrust me through to it." It's twice in this verse and only here in the Deuteronomistic history, other than that one verse. So plainly a connection there. So these uncircumcised, the narrators have been referring to them consistently recently as Philistines. And they're only referred to as uncircumcised one time after this, but we saw it earlier when David referred to them as uncircumcised, and again back in the situation with Jonathan and his armor bearer. So we can see how those scenes are all being recalled. So the uncircumcised may not come and thrust me through and make sport of me. Not the Yitzhak word we hear, as, for example, in Genesis 26 or other places in Genesis, making various plays on the word Yitzhak or Isaac. But here a different word, recalling a different issue of Judges 19:25 and about the Benjaminites. And I won't get into all the details of that because we'll get too far afield. But notice it's a connection there. And it could be translated or deal with me harshly, or as Bodner suggests, suffer abuse. But his armor bearer was unwilling here, wouldn't do it, and for he was terrified. And we note that his terror recalls the terror we saw of Saul in the previous scene with the woman of Endor. So Saul took his own sword and fell upon it, as Goliath died by his own sword, but at the hand of David, as we can see back here in 1750. Striking down the Philistine and killing him, there was no sword in David's hand, and David ran and stood over the Philistine. He grasped his sword, drew it from his sheath, and killed him, and cut off his head, exactly what the Philistines were afraid David would do in chapter 29 to the rest of them. So when the armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, he fell upon his sword and died too. And as my note again suggests below, who is witnessing to this? Only the narrator. So Saul and his 3 sons, and again we'll note more sons to come, and his armor bearer and all his men died together on the same day. We had not heard that all his men died, but it's seeming to suggest here at the end of this that the army is completely wiped out altogether. So all we're going to look at now is how the response of it comes from the people over here. When the men of Israel who are on the other side of the valley, which is to say the valley of Jezreel, and those beyond the Jordan saw, now they certainly didn't see unless they fled that way, which may well be the case. If the men of Israel had fled and that Saul and his sons were dead, and how they could possibly see that, of course they couldn't. So it has to mean that they heard it from somebody, but it's describing a scene. They forsook their towns, using this verb here, which can't be pronounced the ZV here. It's a very common word in the Masoretic text, but it's almost always for forsaking Yahweh. We saw it in chapter 30 a little earlier for the Egyptian servant being forsaken by his Amalekite master, but it's most commonly for forsaking Yahweh, and forsaking Yahweh is associated with monarchy. They have rejected, not using this word, but in chapter 8, Yahweh told Samuel, it's not about you, it's about me. They've rejected me from being king over them, as they have ever since I called them out of Egypt. And that's what's recalled a number of times in the Deuteronomistic history, as well as in the prophets. So as Israel has forsaken Yahweh as king, now they forsake their towns and fled. And it's interesting, they could have thought, well, now David will be in charge, and they don't wait for David. Maybe they don't know about that. There's no reason to particularly think they know about that. But in the absence of Saul and his sons, they basically give up. And the Philistine came and literally settled in their towns. So although the chiasm goes to the next verse of what is involved in the rest of the chapter is the disposal of the bodies, and that's really a new scene. So we'll look at that next time and complete the first book of Samuel. See you then for that.